Today's talk is the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture. I want to tell you a little bit about Robert L. Harris before I introduce our speaker. Harris was a World War II veteran, retired to Sonoma County after a distinguished career in teaching and school administration. For many years, a group in Petaluma coordinated an annual Warsaw Ghetto Uprising event, which then became the annual Holocaust commemoration, Yom HaShoah. At the Yom HaShoah event held in 1983, University President Peter Diamandopoulos challenged Harris, who was that year's coordinator, to do more than just memorialize the Holocaust. This was the beginning of a university-community partnership. In fact, SSU was an ideal place for a program about the Holocaust. Professor John Steiner in the sociology department was a Holocaust survivor. He had begun to teach classes about genocide in the Holocaust. Additionally, Professor Paul Benko, a Holocaust survivor, was a faculty member in the biology department. And Professor George Jackson was a liberator. He was a faculty member in the psychology department. Sylvia Sucre, whom we honored several weeks ago, remembered Robert Harris as, quote, an indefatigable leader with enormous determination who was able to work with all types of people, an inspiration. According to Joel Newberg, a past president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, Robert was a one-person organization. He knew what needed to be done, how to interface with individuals and groups, and how to handle all the fundraising. He simply would ask, and people would donate. So the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust was thus formed in 1983 on behalf of the victims and the survivors of the Holocaust and the desire to tell their stories and learn from their experiences. Today's lecture commemorates the central role that Robert Harris played in creating a lecture series that is now in its 42nd year. Now I can move on to our speaker, Ethan Katz. Katz is Associate Professor of History at the University of California at Berkeley. He is the author of The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, and the co-editor of Colonialism and the Jews, and separately, Secularism in Question, Jews and Judaism in Modern Times. Katz has recently completed the manuscript for another book. And actually, I kind of misconstrued things when I wrote his introduction. It is not the project he's going to talk about today, Operation Torch. In addition to his scholarly life, Katz is chair of the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Jewish Student Life and Campus Climate at UC Berkeley, and the founder of the Anti-Semitism Education Initiative, which seeks to foster conversations about how to assess and counter anti-Semitism in higher education. So I'm very pleased to turn the podium over to Professor Katz. Please bear with me here for just a moment while I get things worked out online. Share our screen. Okay, there's our shared screen, and there we go into slideshow mode. Okay, Ethan, I will step aside.
I understand how this works. Okay, good. Okay. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to take part in this series. I'm honored to give the Robert Harris Memorial Lecture. The whole series of highly distinguished speakers and scholars, and then accidentally, Stephen included me as well.
Before you start, one more thing here. There's one last thing I have to do to make sure we're streaming properly. There we go.
Okay, the only
So
question
why is that? Yeah, why is that? Okay.
Looking better on mainstream people in this room.
Extend.
Good. Looks good up there.
Looks good up there.
Yes, okay. Okay. So let's start with a note that on its face will always seem curious. On March 27th, 1943, Heinz Ruthke, who was the head of the German occupier's office of Jewish affairs in Paris, wrote a memo to his lieutenants in which he said, "The Jews of the Paris region must be concentrated as early as possible into the Jewish camps of Drancy and Bonne-la-Hollande and should be expedited to the east by the fastest route. The execution of these measures must be accelerated in order to avoid any possibility that Jews could play the same sinister role that they did at the time of the landing of American and British troops in North Africa." This document starts to hint at just how interlinked the two sides of the French Mediterranean were for all actors in France during World War II and the Holocaust. And it also reveals the lasting import of the Algiers insurrection. So to what exactly was Ruthke referring? In the early morning hours of November 8th, 1942, the American and British armies began Operation Torch. At that time, the largest amphibious landing in recorded human history. The invasion saw 110,000 troops in 800 warships and transports land on a score of beaches spanning the Mediterranean coastline, the 1,200 miles of coastline, Atlantic and Mediterranean. You see them on the right in this next slide. It's okay. No, it's gonna be fine. Here we go. Okay. It's gonna be fine. Okay. Yes, okay. So yes, you can see the troops landing on the beach there on the right side. The key site for this campaign was North Africa, and everybody involved in the strategic planning agreed that victory ran through the rapid seizure of the city of Algiers. Until that time, North Africa was under the control of the Vichy government, France's authoritarian pro-German regime that had taken power shortly after the French surrender to the Germans in June of 1940. In October of 1940, of its own accord, Vichy had abrogated the Crémieux Decree, an act that in 1870 had made nearly all Algerian Jews into equal French citizens. Algeria had been controlled by France since its conquest of the territory in 1830. And that act, the Crémieux Decree, had been a turning point in Algerian history because it had separated Jews from their Muslim fellow natives who did not enjoy citizenship, and had begun a process whereby Algeria's Jews would gradually become deeply attached to French language and culture. Now, with the stroke of a pen, Jews were suddenly demoted to colonial subjects, occupying the same status as Muslims, and further anti-Semitic measures would follow. It's well known that Operation Torch opened a crucial second front in World War II, soon facing the Axis forces from North Africa, setting in motion the Allied liberation of Southern Europe. What is far less well known is that the Allied path into Algiers was paved by the work of an underground movement in which a band of young political idealists teamed with a group of arch-conservative businessmen. Over a period of months preceding the invasion, the resistors coordinated their efforts with the Americans, in particular with Robert Murphy, the special U.S. envoy to the region who reported directly to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the last days before the invasion, the home of Henri Aboukir became the headquarters for the insurgency. Aboukir was a prominent figure in the Algerian Jewish community and more broadly respected as a doctor, professor, and local political leader. His son, the 22-year-old medical student José Aboukir, who's pictured here on the left, had been one of the earliest resistors in Algeria and would assume central importance in the insurrection. In the wee hours of November 8th, the designated date of the Allied landing, a rather motley group of 377 students, shop owners, doctors, lawyers, and a handful of French military officers managed to take over nearly all of Vichy France's major institutions in Algiers and to place the regime's key leaders under house arrest. The insurrection and the landing came as a shock to the supporters of Vichy, with many pro-German leaders arrested in their own headquarters or even in their own bed. Some were even imprisoned in the jails that they ran. And the element of surprise was critical. Murphy later said that Operation Torch was, quote, partially a bluff. It relied upon catching the enemy off guard and giving the impression of a far more overwhelming amount of manpower and force than the Allies could at that time muster in the war. The success of the underground was all the more remarkable because it faced numerous obstacles. The insurgents were ill-equipped. They only possessed several hundred level rifles that predated World War I and tour buses provided by the Americans. In many cases, their claim to authority was thin. They disguised themselves by wearing armbands with the initials VP, standing for Volontiers de la Place, which was supposed to be a volunteer militia that was tied to the Vichy regime. In the days before the invasion, there were promised arms from the Americans that repeatedly did not arrive. And at the appointed time, on the night of November 8th, about half of the approximately 800 young men who had affiliated with the insurgency in the preceding weeks and months failed to show up. In the midst of all this chaos, José Albuquerque took charge as various teams of insurgents fanned out to key points throughout the city. At a series of locations, the same scene repeated itself. A small group of resistors showed up wearing the armbands of the local militia and showing orders for them to relieve the Vichy commanders. Unsuspecting, the officers on duty turned over control of each strategic location to the members of the insurgents. But as dawn broke, there was still no sign of the Americans. They had taken a rather slow and circuitous route toward Algiers rather than the rapid one that was originally promised. Now Vichy had begun to fight back. Albuquerque utilized a blend of ruse and inspiration to rally the resistors over the radio, imploring them to hold their posts for as long as possible. Eventually, before the next evening, the Allies entered Algiers and took control of the city without firing a shot. Before too long, they would control the broader Mediterranean. 4 months later, and hundreds of miles north in Paris, when Heinz Rothko wrote this frantic fragment with which I began, it was to these Jewish insurgents that he was referring. The liberation of Algeria, however, hardly meant the restoration of the pre-war status quo, as a new battle began over the territory's French leadership and ideological direction. Jews, despite their central role in the uprising, did not succeed immediately in regaining their rights of equal citizenship. For the first few months following the landing, all of the racial laws remained in place, and Jews who had lost their professional position or their property only recovered them on an individual basis. In exchange for his support of the Allies, François Darlan, a notorious pro-German collaborator, became military commander and civilian high commissioner for all of French North Africa. Following Darlan's assassination in late December of 1942, several Jewish leaders of the underground, including Henri and José Albuquerque, were arrested and imprisoned. It was only in March of 1943 that the High Commissioner for Algeria, General Henri Giraud, announced the end of Vichy's racial laws. But in the very same moment, he also abrogated the Crémieux Decree once more. It was only in actually October of 1943 that finally, almost a year after the landing, the Jews of Algeria regained their French citizenship. Scholarship on this story, on the Algerian underground insurgency and its Jewish participants, remains quite limited. Guessing that if I took a survey, almost no one in this room would have ever heard of this story. And to date, to the degree that it's been written about, people have generally focused either on the military and political strategy of the North African landing and its aftermath, or on this episode as a case of Jewish heroism soon betrayed by the American invaders and the French administration. This analysis has left us with very little sense of what I call paths of resistance. That is, who participated in the resistance, what divergent and parallel paths they followed, what was their pre-resistance life like, and what came after the resistance. Right? From what cultural, social, and political worlds did they emerge? What did they have in common? And what different groups could they be separated? Well, beyond the insurgents of Algiers, we actually do not know nearly as much about the topic of sort of social profile for resistors as we do for perpetrators of the Holocaust or wartime collaborators. And so that's among the central questions that I'm examining in the book on this subject that I've been writing. I will spend much of the remainder of my talk examining who made up the resistors of November 8th and how we can understand the character of their movement. First, I'm going to talk about the arch-conservative, so-called Vichisto-resistant. I'll explain what that awkward French term means, who played a key role in leading the movement and coordinating with the Americans. Then I will devote substantial attention to understanding the Jewish participants who formed the core of the resistors mobilized on November 8th. In the third section, I'll discuss the largely unknown matter of what November 8th meant for Muslim resistors in Algeria. In the process, I will tease out some of the larger implications of this story for the history of the resistance during World War II, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And finally, I will ask how each of these elements can help us to understand why the insurgents of Algiers succeeded when so many other resistance movements, Jewish and non-Jewish, failed. We can only appreciate the history and significance of the Algiers insurrection by placing it within the broader context of the Holocaust in North Africa and European political culture in colonial Algeria. Now, many of you are probably wondering, what do I mean when I refer to the Holocaust in North Africa? Central and Eastern Europe were, of course, the site of the greatest anti-Semitic atrocities during the Holocaust. But the nearly 500,000 Jews who lived in French North Africa suffered significantly as well. Many racial laws enacted by the Vichy regime in France were extended to Algeria, Morocco, and to Tunisia, all under French control. And this led to severe professional quotas, intensive surveillance, and more than 100 labor camps where Jewish prisoners were often singled out for especially harsh treatment. In Algeria specifically, Vichy undertook a Jewish census based on the same racial doctrine that prevailed in the unoccupied zone of the French mainland. The government barred Jews from countless public professions, including government administration, the judicial system, education, and the army. And in the private sector, Jews could not continue to work as lawyers, architects, pharmacists, in any sort of profession associated with banking, finance, or commerce, or in public relations. There were widespread so-called economic Aryanization laws, which was an effort to eliminate all Jewish influence from the Algerian economy. By late 1941, almost all Jewish children had been expelled from the public primary schools in Algeria. Most notable and devastating was the decision in autumn of 1940 that I've already mentioned by the Vichy regime to strip all Algerian Jews of their French citizenship, which they had enjoyed for 70 years. There's strong evidence that on the eve of the Allied landing, the French were preparing to make Jews in Algeria wear the notorious yellow star and to begin deporting a certain number of Jews to concentration camps in Europe. The severity of these measures often went farther than those of the French mainland, and that was no coincidence. Pre-war settler political culture in Algeria was steeped in anti-Semitism and what one historian has recently called colonial fascism. Much of the settler population had never accepted the idea that Jews could be equally French, and the emancipation of Algerian Jews with the Crémieux Decree had always been seen as a dangerous precedent for the often discussed but never enacted possibility that Algeria's Muslims, the fellow natives, the much larger number of natives in Algeria, would also receive French citizenship. So for many settlers, the anti-Jewish policies of the Vichy regime in stripping that citizenship away from Jews fulfilled their long-standing fantasies. Just as much of the territory had been annexed to France proper in the 19th century, Algeria is a weird space colonial. It's actually under sort of direct French rule and considered part of France and its main population centers by the late 19th century, unlike most overseas imperial possessions. So just like it had been annexed in this way, during the Holocaust, for many intents and purposes, Algeria was a kind of extension of Europe on the other side of the Mediterranean. In these contexts, it's all the more striking that, as we shall see, the Algiers underground eschewed any sort of political program. This tendency stood in marked contrast to many resistance movements during World War II, including both Jewish and non-Jewish currents within France. When we think of wartime resistance, what are the movements that most often come to mind? Charles de Gaulle's Free France, with its explicitly liberal democratic ideals. The French communists. Among Jews, we think of Zionists, Bundists, and Jewish communists. In every one of these instances, plans for wartime uprising and for a post-war new order tended to go hand in hand. But what we mostly know about the French resistance is a classic case in which history has been written by the victors. The wartime triumph and post-war legacy of the Gaullists and the communists helped create a narrative that makes several assumptions. First, we imagine the French insurgents emerged in opposition not only to the Germans, but also to the pro-German Vichy regime. In addition, conventional depictions portray the resistance as comprised of liberals, Republicans, socialists, and communists. Finally, according to a stubbornly enduring narrative, on one side stood résistants fighting virtuously against Nazi and Vichy anti-Semitism, while on the other side stood anti-Semitic perpetrators and collaborators. The story of the Algiers insurgency disproves each of these assumptions. Quite simply, it does not fit our image of wartime resistance in Europe. First of all, this was in no way an anti-fascist movement. A group of arch-conservative, non-Jewish participants played an essential role in the insurgency. These were well-connected and well-informed French military or business insiders whose direct access to the Americans was vital to the insurrection's viability and relevance. These men were what historians have recently termed Vichisto-resistants. That is, even as they fiercely opposed the Germans and sought to renew the French fight against Nazism, these men had institutional and personal ties, ideological commitments, or both, to Vichy and its so-called national revolution. And the whole conversation about the Vichisto-resistants began because of revelations about François Mitterrand, who's pictured second from the right in that photograph there, that he had a past of having been a right-winger in the 1930s and having been allied with right-wing forces and connected to the Vichy regime during the first years of the war before he became a resistor. This was when Mitterrand was president in the 1990s, and this was sort of a national scandal, and it opened a whole new conversation about people who fit this profile I just described, where they were resistors, they ultimately risked a great deal for the resistance, but they either had moved from being loyal supporters of Vichy, or they saw themselves as kind of fighting the battle that they thought the regime wanted to fight but couldn't fight. That was not true because Marshal Pétain really was loyal to the Germans, the leader of France during the war, but they saw themselves as sort of fighting the battle that he couldn't fight, and so they became these résistants, these resistors, very tied to Vichy at the same time. Recent research on this group has complicated longstanding narratives and assumptions about the ideological meaning of the resistance. But the group of conservative leaders in the Algiers underground differed from most of the known rightist converts to the resistance or extreme right resistors because these men in Algiers teamed with hundreds of Jews fighting for their basic freedoms. More about that in a few minutes. First, in order to account for the importance of the arch-conservatives who played a leading role in the insurrection, we have to turn to the role of the Americans. In North Africa, U.S. envoy Robert Murphy, along with other key American officials, took a decidedly pragmatic approach to looking for French partners with whom they could fight the Germans. For some time, they were not entirely sure whether some version of Vichy might be part of the solution rather than the problem. They, generally speaking, did not like Charles de Gaulle, and they were looking for alternative resistance leaders who they could get behind and work with. Eventually, they became convinced that General Henri Giraud, rather than de Gaulle, was the right man to lead the resistance. There's little evidence that Giraud opposed Vichy's conservative policies. Instead, he was at heart a proud French patriot who believed the Germans could be defeated. What he sought to overturn was Vichy's decision to collaborate with the Germans rather than continue the fight. Giraud himself was unabashedly anti-Semitic. In his memoirs, he would later describe Jews as, quote, pariahs, eternally in conflict with Muslims, and would claim that both groups were characterized by, quote, heated fanaticism. The Americans' choice of Giraud as leader of the resistance highlights what would become a key pattern of their behavior in North Africa, a single-minded focus on winning the war at the expense of most ideological considerations or any particular concern for Algeria's Jews. Giraud stepped into a movement where other prominent Frenchmen from the mainland were also in key roles, many of whom were equally or more conservative. This was particularly true of the so-called Committee of Five, the group of French businessmen and officers who worked closely with the insurgents and the Americans and coordinated many of their efforts. This group included Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie, a committed monarchist. He was widely rumored to have actually participated in something called the Cagoule in the 1930s, which was a right-wing underground movement that stockpiled weapons, assassinated leftists, and planned a coup d'etat against the left-wing Front Populaire government in France. Two other committee members, Jean Rigaud and Jacques Lemaitre-Dubois, were confirmed former members of the Cagoule. Rigaud used his closeness to the Vichy regime to foster contacts between certain officials and the movement in Algiers, and Lemaitre-Dubois admired Vichy's anti-democratic, autocratic tendencies and its arch-conservative National Revolution program of national renewal, and he was deeply suspicious of communism. Both of these men were avowedly anti-Gaullist. In his memoir of the early years of the resistance, Jacques Soustel would claim of Rigaud and Lemaitre-Dubois, quote, their hostility toward Germany was matched by their hostility toward free France. A, quote, free Vichy was not a free France, but rather the National Revolution, Hitlerian shackled and protected by Washington. This is what they wanted, and this is what they almost got. Soustel's caustic remark hinted at a deeper truth that we can better appreciate in light of current scholarship on the Vichisto-Resistants. a key contingent of the insurgency comprised men who, even as they took great risks and joined clandestine networks to resume the fight against the Germans, also had links to Vichy and continued to be influenced in their resistance work by those links. In short, this little-known story may have been the Vichy-Resistant most important hour of the war. What is certain is that it would not have been possible absent their unlikely alliance with a scrappy group of Algerian Jews, to which we will now turn. So we have to take a moment to situate the world from which the Jewish resistors emerged. And a useful explanatory tool here comes from the great Israeli scholar Yaron Tsur of North African Jews, who wrote about what he called sectors in colonial societies in North Africa where Jews lived. In colonial Algeria, during the decades after the Crimea Decree that made Algerian Jews French citizens, Jews by and large moved out of what Tsur calls the native sector. By this term, he denotes the networks of local inhabitants in a colonial setting who were dependent on mastery of the local culture, meaning in the case of Algeria, either Arabs or Berbers. A significant number of Jews soon migrated from this to what he called the westernized sector. This sector comprised those who had acquired French language and culture, but continued to speak Judeo-Arabic in their homes and had the ability to communicate and interact fully with native Muslim society. By the first decades of the 20th century, the largest number of Jews had moved into the third sector, the so-called European one. That is, they had taken full advantage of their access to the European education that was available to very few native Muslims of Algeria, and while some still had a partial foothold in native Arab or Berber society or economy, this was less typical. More and more Jews were only fluent in French, took French names, at least in public, and saw themselves as fully acculturating to France and shedding the Arab or Berber identities of their forebears. Nonetheless, these Jews frequently experienced anti-Semitism on the part of colonial settlers, and they did not, by and large, reject their Jewishness. In this sense, they formed what another eminent historian, David Sorkin, has referred to elsewhere as a Jewish minority subculture of the wider European culture. To paraphrase Sorkin, Algeria's Jewish minority culture was largely made up of elements that appropriated those of broader European and native culture, but they became distinctively Jewish and functioned as a self-contained system of ideas and symbols. This took the form of a press, organizational life, and social structure led and peopled mostly by Jews, and at once linked to and largely independent of the traditional religious community. For most Algerian Jews, despite their ties to the wider, quote, European sector, other Algerian Jewish individuals, groups, and institutions were really what formed their primary community. So forgive me for this extended discussion about terminology and definitions, but it's crucial to have precision if we're to arrive at a better understanding of those who made up the Algerian Jewish participants in the underground and what constituted the group's distinctive characteristics. I'm building a database as part of this project of all the participants in the uprising of November 8th, and based on my preliminary findings, I want to examine briefly three key commonalities among many Jewish resistors that can help us to appreciate the distinctive subculture that cultivated their movement. These are one, the proximate social geography and networks of numerous participants. Two, the frequent connections of resistors to other Jewish causes. And three, the assertion of Jewish manhood that helped to define the character of critical segments of the movement. These enable us to appreciate that the subculture of Algerian Jews formed an indispensable basis for the overwhelming role of Jews in the uprising. The social geography. It's worth noting at the outset that interwar Algiers was demographically a European city. More than 60% of the city's 250,000 to 300,000 inhabitants were of the, quote, European settler classes. Another 9% were Jewish and slightly under 1/3 were Muslim. This meant that Algiers' entire Jewish population and its increasingly French linguistic and cultural orientation was in many ways a subculture within the majority culture of the city. As larger numbers of Jews became more European in their culture, and a small but growing minority took up middle-class professions as civil servants, shopkeepers, jewelers, journalists, accountants, salesmen, and the like, many moved to new surroundings within the city. We see here in this slide sort of the key traditional neighborhoods where many Jews continued to live, the broader area that I've marked there in gray, and then a few particular concentrations that I've marked in white. By the early 1930s, even as Jews still made up between 20 and 80% of the inhabitants on most of the streets of the old Jewish quarter, marked there in gray. Sorry, that was in. Okay, sorry. That was the old Jewish quarter of what's called the Lower Kasbah. Increasing numbers had migrated to form a sizable Jewish presence in the Bab el-Wad neighborhood to the northwest, or among the most successful to the southeast in the neighborhoods toward and along the Rue de Michelet. The Rue Bab Azoun, which formed part of the western border of the traditional Jewish section, is a street crucial to the story of the insurgents. In 1940, it remained a major Jewish artery. Running parallel to that street was the wide European avenue of the Rue de Lyon, one of the first streets with which the French invaders had breached the old Jewish quarter in the 19th century as they remade the city. Even in 1940, there and the nearby Place des Chartres, also marked here, were still really the city's Jewish commercial center. Many, if not most, of the Jewish participants in the insurrection lived or worked in either the Bab Azoun and the adjacent more middle-class area further south, or in the Bab el-Wad. Most of these were men between ages of 17 and 45, many of them were under 30. For instance, at 11 Rue Bab Azoun lived two families, the Atlon and the Abouker, who would prove central to the uprising. Emile Atlon was one of the founders of the so-called GLS group, a kind of Jewish defense force that provided many of the shock troops for the insurgency. Yes, so the leaders of the GLS group are pictured there on the left with their medals after the war. And so until Vichy forbade him from doing so, Atlon actually ran on the right here, ran a gun shop on the Rue des Chartres that provided many of the early weapons for this GLS group. And on the night of November 7th, dozens of insurgents under his direction gathered at their apartment. His wife, Florence, kept everyone fed well as they waited to go into action, and they hid the resistors' guns under the roof in case the police arrived. One floor up lived Raphael and Stéphane Abouker, sons of the deceased Dr. Charles Abouker. They would serve as the crucial liaisons between the GLS group and those working to prepare the American landing. Not far to the south, José Abouker, who was the cousin of Raphael and Stéphane, assumed his own pivotal role. Only weeks before the landing, José convinced his father, Henri, to allow their apartment at 26 Rue de Michelet to become the central hub of operations for the underground in the days and hours preceding the landing. Among the many Jewish merchants who formed a network of Jewish-run kiosks on the Rue de Lyon and the Place des Chartres, no fewer than 28 turned up for the uprising of November 8th. Hailing from the adjacent, less affluent quarter to the northwest, many of those who took orders that night from José Abouker would be referred to later as his, quote, gangs from Bab el-Wad. The second element of the subculture, Jewish involvement, becomes evident when we see how many of the Jews who peopled this movement were from families with deep histories at the heart of the Algerian Jewish community. Most central and prominent were the Abouker, a family that had come from Iberia in the 1500s and had been prominent in community politics for more than a century. The cousins, Charles and Henri Abouker, were generous financial supporters of Jewish institutions for years. In the 1930s, both held leading positions in Jewish-led organizations that sought to fight anti-Semitism and improve relations with the Muslim and Christian population. These included the major community political organizations, the Algerian Jewish Community of Social Studies, and the Algerian branch of the largest French anti-racist association, the International League Against Racism and Anti-Semitism, the Katz. Among the central participants in the uprising would be not only Henri, his children José and Colette, and their cousins Raphael and Stéphane that I've already mentioned, but also several members of the Carcassonne and Carcenti branches of the Abouker family who lived in Oran. We have a total of like 15 different cousins and uncles and siblings from the Abouker family that participate in the insurgency. It's quite an extraordinary family. We can talk more about them in the Q&A. Elie Gozlan, who was himself active in the Algerian Jewish Committee of Social Studies, the CJAES, and was a longtime editor of the community newspaper, the Bulletin of the Federation of Jewish Societies of Algeria. He had two sons, Jean and Julien, who became decorated for their role on the night of the uprising. Those are just a few of the numerous examples wherein a new generation of activists born into this distinctive Algerian Jewish subculture that spanned the Western and European sectors of Algiers society, that generation was effectively following in the footsteps of its parents. But the active Jewishness of the participants goes beyond family lineage or social milieu. Among the founders of the GLS organization were Emile Atlon and André Timim, both former activists in the recently banned Lika organization. And I found at least 25 former Lika activists who participated in the insurrection, many of them through the GLS group. The pre-war Jewish involvement of some other participants took the form of charity. Pierre Ada and Emile Gian, for instance, were among those who made generous donations in the 1938 fund to buy shoes for needy children at the local Talmud Torah, the Jewish day school. During the war, numerous Jews who took part in the underground also found a role in creating a newly self-reliant Jewish community structure. Up and both kicked out of the faculty of the University of Algiers, became active early on in the underground, and they also were among the former professors and teachers in French public institutions who now became educators in a rapidly constituted network of Jewish schools to support those Jewish school children who had been kicked out of French public schools. Created through the Jewish community framework to accommodate thousands of Jewish children, these new schools maintained the French secular curriculum, but also added optional classes in Hebrew and Jewish history. These few examples suggest that even as their culture, politics, and choices of wartime action may have been insistently French, and many people would later say our resistance was French, we were French, don't call us a Jewish resistance, even if 85% of the resistors were Jewish. But even if that's the case, and they were insistently French in the way that they thought about their resistance, we can see that most of them were neither Jews by coincidence, nor mobilized merely because they had lost their citizenship to the new regime. By and large, these were Jews who, whatever their level of traditional religious practice, surrounded themselves socially, commercially, culturally, and politically with fellow Jews of similar outlook and background. The last element of the subculture, Jewish manhood, damaged and remade. The third distinguishing characteristic is the way that many members joined the movement in part as a response to a moment of what must be regarded, in the words of historian Mary Louise Roberts, as damaged manhood or masculinity. Since the 19th century, Algeria's Jews had internalized French ideas of bourgeois masculinity, that valorized military service, citizenship, economic success, and the nuclear family. Assertions of masculinity were in many respects more strident among the general European population in Algeria as compared to the European mainland. Moreover, colonialists repeatedly insisted on the abnormality of the gender, sexual, and family dynamics of Muslims. Meanwhile, anti-Semitism, which was ubiquitous, as I've already mentioned, in Algerian settler society for decades, also frequently figured the Jew as abnormal in body, sex, gender, and family life. So there's a lot that Jews were fighting against by trying to insist on being manly and of normal masculinity among men, and normal in their family relations and structure as a means of integration in Algerian and French society for decades before World War II and the Holocaust. But now in autumn of 1940, their citizenship, their capacity for army service, their financial security, and even their normal family life had been upended by the measures of the Vichy regime. Beyond the loss of citizenship experienced by all, as soldiers, thousands of Jewish men had taken part in a defeated army that had failed to defend successfully the French mainland, and numerous Jewish soldiers had been captured and imprisoned or discharged from the French army. Following the armistice, hundreds of Algerian Jewish soldiers were shipped off to work in 4 specially designated concentration camps in the Algerian Sahara. Sweltering during the day and freezing overnight with inadequate food and hygiene, these camps stripped these Jews not only of their military rank, but also of their basic dignity. Here, here's an example of one of these camps called Bindo, and this map to the left, it shows some of the system of labor camps in North Africa, although it's really an undersell because there were a lot more camps that are shown on that map. With the severe professional quotas that were also imposed by the new regime, many men could no longer support their families as they had before. For many Jews, this loss of work and livelihood, coupled with their children's inability to attend French schools, had altered traditional family dynamics. In this way, the war had directly damaged many elements of what had previously constituted the basic manhood of Algerian Jews. In this light, it's not at all surprising that many participants in the insurrection were veterans of the campaign of 1940 who had returned from the battlefield or escaped from prisoner of war camps and now sought to resume the fight. Typical is the statement of Paul de Goff that without even knowing of Charles de Gaulle's June 18th so-called call to resistance from London, when he and his comrades came home following the French surrender, quote, "We thought the war had only begun." Such a preponderance of Jews from the military not only reflected Jews' high level of integration and longstanding service to the state. Crucially, it afforded them relationships with non-Jewish officers such as André Achiavi, Jean Jus, and Alfred Pirafor, who were really crucial insiders in Algiers, whose roles would end up being really important in the success of the underground. By far the clearest case of the effort to reclaim Jewish manhood appeared in the GHLS self-defense group that formed in autumn of 1940, and that would in time supply 130 of the insurgents who fought on November 8th. This group saw itself largely as a training ground for the Jewish shock troops who would both prepare to fight against Hitler and to defend Jews. Its ranks included 80 so-called toughs, described by resistor Lucien Ades as, quote, muscular daring fighters. They were ready at a moment's notice to confront the local militias that regularly attacked Jews. The group was organized into self-contained military units. Members trained in a locale called the GHLS Gymnasium, run by a local boxer by the name of GHLS, and peopled by the most famous boxers of the era, like Marcel Cerdan and Germain Perez. Jewish member Paul Sebouan, who was an expert fencer, set up lessons through which a number of future resistors became highly skilled in swordsmanship and self-defense. And it may sound odd, but fencing was considered a super manly sport in the late 19th to the mid 20th century. And there were many Jews who became successful in the Olympics, actually, in Eastern Europe, again, as a way to assert Jewish manhood. It's little wonder that two of the founders of the GHLS group were Émile Atlan and André Temim, who I mentioned, who were not only former members of the Lika, which was itself something of a Jewish self-defense group, but also former teammates on the local Jewish soccer team, the Étoile Sportive Algéroise. By building a Jewish defense force that would both take on local physical threats to Jews and prepare to fight alongside the Allies, these Jews were reclaiming the French bourgeois ideals of manhood that had been taken from them by the war's events and the policies of the Vichy government and the Nazis. New aspirants to the GHLS group were closely screened. If accepted, then they had to take an oath to fight to the death for the liberation of France and the defeat of the Germans, and specifically to defend Algerian Jews. The goals of many Jewish resistors did not align altogether with those of the Vichistes résistants with whom they conspired. Right? First group was very conservative, featured a number of monarchists. It featured a number of people who had been aligned with fascist groups, and these Jews were fighting in part to regain their citizenship. They were by and large affiliated with liberal or socialist political groups. And this was so much the case that José Aboukir, as the leader of the sort of shock troops and most of the Jewish resistors, and Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie, this member and leader from the Committee of Five, from the Arch Conservatives, who was from this really old, deeply committed monarchist family, they understood that their alliance based on really disparate goals in terms of long-term politics could only be possible if they reached a formal agreement that they would not engage in any kind of political program as long as they were pursuing the common goal of helping the Allies land and liberating the region so that it could rejoin the fight against the Germans in the war. And they did just that. They had a formal understanding that each group would be able to immediately regain its freedom of political action after the successful Allied landing. It's sort of an extreme story of a mixture of strange bedfellows and pragmatism, and it defies our enduring assumptions about the ideological stakes of both Jewish and non-Jewish resistance during the war. Now let's complicate the picture even a little bit further by talking about the relative absences and alternative path to resistance on the part of North African Muslims. Only a handful of Muslims participated in the Algiers uprising. Many Muslim activists were busily forging their own avenues of resistance. In time, large numbers joined communist groups or the liberation armies of Free France. Others, particularly after the 1941 Atlantic Charter, drew inspiration from the idea of the war as a struggle for universal freedoms to press on the cause of Algerian Muslim rights and even for ideas of independence. By March of 1943, under the leadership of Ferhat Abbas, who was a longtime advocate for Muslim assimilation in Algeria, there emerged a consensus document, the Manifeste du Peuple Algérien, which brought together the key ideas of most major Algerian Muslim political groups. The Manifeste constituted a watershed for the likes of Abbas, despite the fact that it maintained a language of equality based on Republican principles. Its demands of Algerian citizenship and autonomy gave it an unmistakably nationalist undertone. A new movement that emerged from this, called the Friends of the Manifeste and of Freedom, had immediate resonance. By 1944, some 500,000 Algerian Muslims came to the headquarters of this movement in Algiers to join. In this moment of emerging Algerian national consciousness, Muslims saw the demotion of Jews to indigenous people of Algeria as integral to the wider colonial situation. On the one hand, the abrogation of the Crimea Decree concerned Jewish and not Muslim natives of Algeria. On the other hand, Muslim leaders repeatedly expressed their lack of desire to become equal by the lowering of Jews. Furthermore, many who had long called for liberal reforms that would equalize Muslim status in French Algeria now reassessed the significance of French citizenship in light of the revelation that it could be revoked instantly from a group that had enjoyed it for 70 years. The authors of the Manifeste were quite explicit on this point. They wrote, quote, "In the future, an Algerian Muslim will not demand anything other than being a Muslim Algerian. Particularly since the abrogation of the Crimea Decree, Algerian nationality and citizenship have offered him greater security and carried a clearer and more logical solution to the problem of his evolution and his emancipation." So right there in that manifest, which is really supposed to be about Algerian Muslim rights, they mention this act of abrogating citizenship for the Jews of Algeria. Abbas and his circle not only saw anti-Jewish persecution as a dangerous precedent for all indigenous subjects who aspire to French citizenship, they also displayed direct solidarity with Jews. The months after the revocation of the Crimea Decree, Abbas's newspaper pointedly asserted Islam's tolerance and anti-racist contrast to what the Vichy regime had just done. Ali Boumediene, who was a leading associate of Abbas, denounced the abrogation of the decree and even used his position on the Algiers Municipal Council to try to protect Jewish property from being seized. Under these circumstances, it shouldn't be entirely surprising that I have discovered an exceptional case of a leading Abbas associate who went a step further and actually participated in the movement of the insurrection. Mohammed Abdelaziz Kassus, pictured here, one of Abbas's most longtime and trusted colleagues, and among the key architects actually of that document, the Manifeste itself. Kassus's direct involvement in a largely Jewish insurrection was in many respects an extension of his interwar activism. During the 1920s and 1930s, like Abbas, the French-educated Kassus participated in the integrationist movement, the so-called Young Algerians. In the mid to late 1930s, he became a supporter of the anti-fascist left-wing coalition of the Front Populaire. To an unusual degree, he translated his anti-fascism into efforts to promote Jewish-Muslim entente in the face of Nazism and colonial racism. He even served as the vice president of the Orange section of the International League Against Anti-Semitism and Racism, the LICA, that I mentioned earlier. Kassus spoke regularly in anti-racist meetings, where he discussed optimistically the fusion of Jewish and Muslim youth movements, read verses from the Quran that he claimed forbade persecution of Jews, and emphasized the interconnectedness between colonial anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism. In deciding to join up with the insurgency, Kassus revealed further the depth of his belief in the inseparability of Muslim and Jewish destinies. This conviction was widely shared, albeit to frequently contrasting ends. For months after the landing, various American and French officials explained the ongoing lack of Jewish rights in Algeria by citing the intensity and penetrating impact of Axis anti-Semitic propaganda among Muslims in North Africa, or the deep-seated nature of Muslim anti-Jewish enmity that they claimed existed. Under such circumstances, they said, reinstating French citizenship for Jews would pose a grave risk to Muslim morale and loyalty to the Allied cause. In fact, as we've already seen, Muslims by and large assess the meaning of anti-Jewish measures through fraternal rather than oppositional eyes. In the months after the landing, along with the reference in the Manifeste itself, Muslim leaders like Ahmed Boumediene and Sheikh Tayyib el-Oqbi made declarations insisting that there was no antagonism between Muslims and Jews. And they even said that the revocation of the Crimea Decree had not made Muslims celebrate, but rather made them worry about their own future under French rule. Newfound Muslim solidarity with Jews also could mean new demands for reciprocity. Beginning in December of 1942, a month or so after the landing, several Muslim leaders, including Ferhat Abbas, argued very explicitly that the present circumstances should lead Jews not to settle for a restoration of their own citizenship alone, but instead to call for equality of rights for all inhabitants of Algeria and to insist on that. Jews debated the same question after the landing. Some contended that Jews now must reassess their position and fight not for a return to the status quo, but rather for equal rights for all. A more cautious position, however, advocated by none other than Henri Algiers, his father, who was at that point the head of the reactivated political arm of the community, the Algerian Jewish Committee of Social Studies. That position is the one that won out. Jews would focus first on reacquiring their own rights and then turn to the cause of equality for Muslims as well. Algiers and other Jewish leaders kept their word. In January 1944, after they had received their own citizenship back in October of the previous year, the Federation of Jewish Societies of Algeria announced in its newsletter, quote, "As high as the leaders responsible for the future of France want to elevate the Muslim population, just as great will be the satisfaction of the leaders of the population of the country." The next year, in May, after French police and colonial settlers brutally repressed the anti-colonial demonstrations in Sétif and Guelma, murdered thousands of Muslims, arrested thousands more, several Jews, including Henri and José Albuquerque, were among the very first to call publicly for amnesty for those arrested and for an investigation of the repression. Many people have treated the nearly year-long delay from the time of the landing to the restoration of citizenship for Algerian Jews as simply a betrayal of the Jewish rebels on the part of both the Americans and the French leaders of the insurrection. But if we place the movement in broader context, as I've tried to do here, it becomes clear just how important it was that this resistance effort, unlike those informed by a common political vision, disdained and basically refused any kind of ideology. So it was only in the wake of the Allied landing that the Algiers rebels began to fight it out over their disparate visions of the French nation and empire. With the slate wiped clean in an Algeria rife with anti-Semitism and the conservative supporters of Henri Giraud vying with the pro-de-Gaulle forces for control of Free France, there were even monarchists who participated in the insurrection who brought the pretender to the French throne to Algiers and briefly tried to restore the monarchy. Just to be clear about how much the field seemed open in that moment. So in that context, there was no guarantee that the cause of Jewish rights would win out. The interconnected uncertainty of Muslims' political future complicated matters further. And so in this light, the period of November 1942 to autumn 1943, during which anti-Jewish disabilities remained in effect, looks like the first phase in a protracted but ultimately triumphant struggle on the part of the Jewish resistors who envisioned the insurrection as paving the way for the return or even expansion of Republican citizenship law, over and against those who perceived it simply as the means to renew the fight against the Germans while defending the policies of Vichy or even turning back to the monarchy. So, as we've seen, there are many implications to the history of those who took part in the insurrection of November 8th. It's highly revealing of what I've called the Algerian Jewish subculture of the broader European sector of Algerian society, and the way that kinship networks, involvement in Jewish affairs, and manhood were all fundamental to that culture. Important, too, were myriad interconnections between many Jewish liberals in Algeria and liberal reformers. This made the causes of Jewish and Muslim rights during the war at once discrete and inseparable. Perhaps most fundamental has been the way that the unlikely alliance at the heart of the November 8th insurrection between Jews and frequently anti-Semitic arch-conservatives forces us to rethink our conventional picture of who resisted and why during World War II. I want to conclude by placing the story of the Algiers insurrection in a bit of comparative context by asking why mostly Jewish resistors, anchored in many respects in a Jewish subculture, succeeded where so many other Jewish resistance efforts failed. In assessing this issue, we can benefit from returning to the formulation of French historian and resistance veteran Henri Michel of more than 40 years ago. Michel enumerates the reasons for the relative lack of success of most Jewish resistance movements. He argues that unlike certain groups that resisted more successfully, Jews throughout Europe tended to lack three things: the support of local populations, trained personnel and needed military equipment, and strong ties to the Allied forces or the in-exile governments connected to the larger resistance movement. In the case of Algiers, this combination must be modified. The local population of Algeria was at once sympathetic, indifferent, and hostile to the Jews, fate, and their resistance efforts. As we've seen, many Muslims offered Jews solidarity during the war. At the same time, they were largely focused on their own future relationship to France and assessed the changes of the war in terms of whether they might bring reform, a new colonial master, or even independence. The European settlers, meanwhile, included numerous anti-Semites who had long demanded the revocation of the Crimea Decree, and they were quite pleased with the new status quo ante, fearing that with the American arrival, the situation might change. But on the whole, the social environment for resistance can hardly be called a great deal better than in even many areas of Europe fairly hostile to Jews. On the second point, training and equipment, the picture is also mixed. Those Jews who were part of the so-called Geogas group, which had used the Geogas gymnasium as a front for training activities since late 1940, were indeed better trained than many Jewish resistors elsewhere. Yet this only constituted perhaps a third of the insurgents who showed up on the night of November 8th. Meanwhile, as we've already said, the insurgents were stuck using limited and outdated weaponry. Most of them, by the way, didn't have any idea how to fire the guns that they had. But on the third issue, that of the relations with the Allies and the government in exile, the situation in Algiers was indeed markedly different from that of Jewish resistors elsewhere. Joseph Boulker and other Jewish resistors had been in touch with the Americans for months before the plans for the invasion were finalized and had coordinated their efforts with the Committee of Five. It's almost certainly the case that absent close relationships and coordination with both this group and the Allies, the Jewish components of the Algiers insurrection would have seen their efforts amount to little. Other factors are also important, of course, the discrete nature of the tasks that the insurrection had to complete. Unlike the protracted struggles of those in the ghettos, foothills, and death camps of Eastern Europe, Boulker and his co-conspirators only had to conquer and occupy a limited number of strategic posts and imprison several key officials, all for a matter of hours. In addition, Algeria was never occupied by Germany and was not the site of the kind of intense military battles and anti-Semitic violence that characterized the killing fields of Eastern Europe. And yet none of this should minimize what the resistors achieved. Through a combination of cunning, guile, strategic alliance, and courage, several hundred Jews teamed with a handful of other resistors to play a major role in the Allied landing that Winston Churchill later referred to as the turning of the tide in the Second World War.
So let me take it off screen share. And we're happy to take questions. It's always the privilege of students in the course to ask the first question. Yeah, Julia.
Hi, my name is Julia. Are there any accounts of the pro-Vichy contingent in the insurgency expressing that kind of anti-Semitic feeling to the Jews that they were kind of fighting alongside? Or was that suppressed to an extent because, like, okay, we're all here, we're all, fighting together? You mentioned that they kind of agreed to let bygones be bygones while they were fighting and to set political differences aside until the end, but were they able to separate themselves to that extent?
That's a really good question. And I think by and large, so first of all, by and large, they're not like around each other for extended periods usually, right? They have certain important meetings, but they're sort of in their own kind of corners and in their own social worlds in many ways, right? So, a lot of the anti-Semitism of these conservatives is like casual social anti-Semitism in terms of sort of a way of, talking and thinking that was quite common in, more elite and sort of Catholic French society in conservative society in the 1930s. One thing that's interesting, though, is that the pretender to the French throne, who, as I mentioned, is brought to Algiers briefly after the landing by Henri de la Vicherie in an effort to restore the monarchy that had not been in power, just parenthetically, since 1848. He actually had published an article in 1939, I think it's 1939, in a Catholic or Christian newspaper that gets reprinted in the Algerian Jewish newsletter, where he denounces the anti-Semitism that's going on, and he basically defends Jews who had fought in World War I as French patriots. And that is an interesting thing to me because it suggests that there was a certain kind of thawing of. He also had come out against Charles Maurras, who was this neo-monarchist who was a virulent anti-Semite, and so he had come out, he separated himself from Maurras, and so I think there was a signal that they were not going to embrace the kind of anti-Semitism of Vichy. And the fact that that was published in the Algerian Jewish newspaper means that especially families like the Abouker, who ended up working really closely with them, probably knew about it, right? So I think, you know, there were sort of some indications that, you know, at least some of these folks not embracing sort of vicious anti-Semitism.
Other questions?
You want over here?
Yeah, Andrea.
Professor, can you say a little bit more about the Gang of Five and whether you suspected perhaps money changed hands and perhaps they were paying the younger Jews to do the dangerous work of revolution? And can you talk about whether the reason for coming together was perhaps that the Gang of Five and the Jewish community saw that Vichy was bad for business and it's more kind of a business transaction? What do you know about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, you're onto something. It's a little different than sort of your speculation, but you're onto something important. So the Committee of Five, those folks, they're by and large quite wealthy, very successful business people who relocate from the French mainland to Algeria in part for business reasons during the war. And yeah, they're in conversation with the Americans about production and goods and shipments and all these sorts of issues. And they clearly are, you know, partly thinking about their business interests. And, you know, sometimes it's quite complicated because sometimes they also have business interests tied up in Vichy. There's no indication that I've seen that they gave money to the Jews to join as insurgents. Did they provide money? Probably for some items here or there, sure. But what the Jewish participants most want is their citizenship back, right? And in some ways, the participation is a kind of act of patriotism that's reclaiming their Frenchness through action. So I don't think they're also experiencing all kinds of terrible hardships in terms of being kicked out of universities, kicked out of their jobs. So these are the material impact of those things is not inconsiderable. But the motivations on the part of the conservatives are often economic. But I don't think that's by and large the case for the Jews or that they're paying.
So if I understand you correctly, the Algerian Jews that are at the center of your attention are not assimilated Ashkenazi who became part of the settler colonial class in the 19th century and moved from mainland France to Algeria. They are Sephardi. And so I wonder if the concept of indigeneity may help explain this unusual alliance that you've uncovered, because they benefit from being indigenous in Muslim eyes.
Yes, I've been writing a lot about indigeneity and settler colonialism in the book I just finished, including comparing to the Algerian situation, which is why I chuckled at the question, which is a good question. So first of all, yeah, very few of them are Ashkenazi, and that's just true for the overall population, right? You have a select number of maybe a few hundred who came from Alsace in the 19th century, particularly after the fall of Alsace-Lorraine to the Germans in 1870, 71. But the vast majority of the population are folks whose families had either been there for millennia, who were quite Arabized, or in smaller cases Berber, or whose families had come from Iberia after the expulsions in the 15th century. Yeah, I mean, the question of how that relates to their participation, I'm not sure I totally follow your logic. Are you saying that they had a certain kind of level of insight and comfort as being indigenous?
Well, or that they're accepted by Algerian Muslims as being indigenous to Algeria.
Right. Okay. So let's back up. So something I didn't say, but which is important, is that the size of the settler population in Algeria European settler population is enormous.
Yeah.
Right? By the early 50s, it's over 1 million. So, it's not like a place that has sort of like, a few thousand or, 20 or 50,000 settlers, right? It has this huge settler population. Jews' relationship to native Muslims in Algeria is complicated by 1940 because there's a lot of resentment about the fact that they became French citizens in 1870, and that even though a lot of them retain important social and cultural ties to native Algerian society, they started going to French public schools, which almost no Muslims could. They started serving in different kinds of civil service positions that very few Muslims can enter. They start using French first names in public, even though they often keep Hebrew names in private, traditional Jewish names in private. So they really are moving. Now they face virulent anti-Semitism frequently, much more virulent than in France proper. Almost like Poland in the 30s in terms of like these anti-Semitic political parties among the settlers in Algeria. So yeah, I think that what makes them distinct is in part, despite everything I just said, they can move between worlds, right? So they do have some credibility in Algerian society, and they also are, very Frenchified in a certain way at the same time. So I think like that sort of experience of malleability plays some role in their capacity.
And so if we fast forward into the 1970s and 80s, what goes wrong? I assume that by 1975, there are very few Jews.
Oh, forget 75. Forget 75. It's not like, no. So I write a lot about this in my first book. So by 62, almost all ago, right? So 54 to 62 is the Algerian War for Independence. It's a whole struggle. It's a whole story. It's a fascinating story in terms of the Jewish experience of that war. But by the late stages of that war, Jews are in sort of this largely wait and see mode. There's a certain number who do participate in the FLN, the National Liberation Front that fights for independence. Probably more of them participate in this right-wing guerrilla group, the OAS, even though they don't like their tactics very much, but they're like the one thing standing between, the independence fighters and France leaving. And basically the Algerian Jews are like, we want Algeria to become more equal. We're for reforms. But somehow we're hoping that that's what's going to happen because the idea of France leaving really scares us. We're very attached to France. We don't have confidence in our security. And there's lots of reasons for that also in terms of what's going on elsewhere in North Africa. What's going on with the rise of Pan-Arabism, with Nasserism. And then the Algerian Muslims won't guarantee that people can go to Israel to travel to see family. There's these announcements in the early 60s. There's a whole kind of tug of war about these things. And they're like really pressuring people in the community to come out clearly in favor of independence in a way that makes people very uncomfortable. So ultimately, the Algerian Jews feel like, the presence of the French is essential to their capacity to stay in Algeria with security.
And do they migrate to Israel or to France?
Overwhelmingly to France. 90% of them come to France. It's unique. It's the only case of a Arab speaking country where the majority of Jews don't go to Israel, and they speak about it in the same terminology as the settlers, who also overwhelmingly go in 61, 62. They use the phrase over and over again of being rapatrié. Right. Most of them had never, or maybe they'd been to mainland France on vacation, right? Most of them certainly had never lived in mainland France before, but they speak about it as returning to France because they feel deeply attached to French culture and language.
Other questions?
Well, I just want to be clear about the Vichy still resistance.
Yes.
Were they conservatives who were pro-Vichy, or were they conservatives who were active Vichyists who I'm interpreting it as that they were sort of Vichy businessmen and militarists who were trying to kind of hedge their bets geopolitically because they might have interests in that area. so that regardless of what the outcome of the eventual outcome of the war would be, that they would still be protecting their own interests as a conservative minority within a larger Vichy majority.
Yeah, so I mean, there really are a few different kind of stripes of the Vichy resistance, right? So there are people who really move in the course of the war from being loyal to Vichy to becoming resistors. Some of them, it's clearly very self-interested. Some of them, they actually early on don't realize how much Vichy is totally in the can for the Germans, and they come over time to realize that, or they don't realize sort of how authoritarian the regime is going to be, and they change their outlook. Someone like Mitterrand, who had connections with the right, is probably an example of someone who had an evolution. But then there are people who basically maintain strong ties to Vichy, like some of these folks in the Committee of Five, while participating in resistance, right? Very, very early, there were people who were like in the Vichy civil service in the town of Vichy who said, like, we have to be the resistors that Marshal Pétain cannot be. So there are people actually from very early on, and some of them are also these arch conservatives who, really, they're never going to be aligned with the vast majority of the resistors, communists, socialists, liberals, but they are strong patriots. So then they might support a lot of the social policy of the Vichy regime, but they don't support the decision to collaborate. So it's a spectrum of folks with some ties to Vichy. And the reason they get clustered together and that they're sort of notable to think about together is that the whole label is it's a modification of a kind of binary way of thinking, which was that, like, you were either a supporter of Vichy or you were a resistor, and that you classified people very neatly that way in terms of their wartime conduct. And it's the realization that a lot of people have a more kind of gray story.
Other questions?
Well, I had one follow-up question about the camps that you speak of. Who was managing these camps? Who were brought to the camps? And what were those circle structures that were in the camp? And what was the purpose of the camps? Were they Vichy-run camps or German camps?
Very good question. So most of them are Vichy-run camps because Vichy has sovereignty in most of French North Africa, right? There are also, by the way, camps in Libya, and actually the largest camp, Giado, in North Africa is in Libya, Italian Libya. It's another subject, but Algeria, the camps are all run by Vichy. Morocco, they're run by Vichy. Tunisia, there are Vichy camps, but then the Germans control Tunisia from the time that the Allies land in November of 42 until May of 43, when Tunisia is liberated. During that time, the Germans really they appear to have been quite determined to accelerate anti-Semitic measures. There are Jews in Tunisia who wear the yellow star during that time. They exact huge indemnities, like fines from the Jewish communities in Tunisia, sort of as a way to extort them as the communities try to protect Jews. So there are some German-run camps in Tunisia during that period. These are labor camps. There is some evidence that had the Germans controlled Tunisia for longer, they would have potentially instituted exterminatory measures in the camps there, but fortunately they were not able to do that. So these are labor camps. They're labor camps that, like a lot of labor camps in Europe, they have a real mixture. They have a lot of communists, they have a lot of socialists, they have Republicans from Spain, they have a lot of foreigners in these camps. I think the estimate is that maybe 20,000 Jews total were in these camps. But they do often set aside harsher measures for the Jews in the camps. And there were, as I think I mentioned, 4 separate camps in the Algerian South just for Jewish soldiers who were veterans of 1940. one of the main purposes of the Vichy camps is the construction of a trans-Saharan railroad, which had been a project during the 1930s that was spoken about and advocated by certain people, but hadn't really gotten off the ground that far. Vichy expends a lot of effort. Vichy is, I wish I had my slide here that I use in what I lecture sometimes about empire during World War II, which is like this huge map that shows all the different Vichy possessions during World War II. And there were board games that look like this map. And there's really an obsession with empire on the part of Vichy because they were able to retain the empire, right? The Germans did not take any parts of the empire, and they view the empire as their last great bargaining chip with the Germans. They view it as their guarantor of trying to return to a sense of glory and power after the war. And so they're very, very determined to really, build within the empire, to exact as much loyalty from their imperial subjects as possible. They spent a lot of time trying to court Muslim support, both in the mainland and in North Africa, because they're worried that the Germans are going to pull Muslim loyalty away from France. So the Trans-Saharan Railroad is sort of an illustration of their empire building that they're trying to do even in wartime. So that ends up, a lot of the camps are along the construction path for the railroad. If you go to North Africa today, you can see these places where there are these little bits of railroad and these little remains from a lot of these smaller camps.
Any final questions? Yeah, Andrea. Oh, Andrea, go ahead.
Oh, what were those round things in the picture?
Well, we can go back and look at that picture. I
Let
don't
me unblind.
know if I'm going to have a great answer for you.
Uh-oh.
But let's see if we can figure it out together.
It might be cisterns.
Oh, I think if you
I got it.
click on that.
Okay. Cisterns, like a good guess. Cisterns, well,
So many.
there are a lot of them, you're right. Good question. I'm sorry because I'm not an expert on the sort of topography of these camps, but I will see if I can learn the answer to the question. Like to myself.
Andrea.
Can you say more about when the Americans and allies arrive, sort of what happens to Algeria immediately thereafter? Is a war is on, so we don't expect sort of ordinary government.
Right. So yeah, what happens is in some ways a scandal. I mean, the Americans were actually clear for quite some time that they didn't actually really care about what kind of governmental regime was installed after they landed in Algeria, as long as it was loyal to the Allied cause, right? So they actually don't hide that fact, but nonetheless, the fact that Darlan, this guy who was a staunch pro-German, who had actually been at one point the sort of prime minister under Marshal Pétain and the Vichy government, certainly anti-Semitic. The fact that he is put in power is regarded by some people as scandalous. It was actually supposed to be that Giraud was going to be the leader, but Giraud is in Gibraltar bargaining with the Americans, insisting that he has to be in charge of every soldier in North Africa, and the Americans are like, yeah, that's never going to happen. And so he kind of messes up because he's like so argumentative, and then Darlan, they flip, and Darlan, is a pretty crafty guy that sees which way the wind is blowing, and so he offers to come in and take charge of the Americans. And there's all these people who he keeps in government who were supporters of Vichy, and then like Rigaud, one of the Committee of Five, is in the new government, and he actually is one of the people who orders the arrests of the Abu Khair and a whole bunch of other Jews who were in the movement. So this moment is regarded really as a betrayal by a lot of people because of the fact that the Americans do this, and there's a big campaign in the American Jewish community and beyond just the Jewish community of people saying like, this is not right. The Crimea Decree should be restored. We've embraced this, authoritarian anti-Semitic regime in Algeria. Robert Murphy, if you read his memoir, he's kind of very defensive about why they didn't restore citizenship right away for Algerian Jews. It says, it was very different, and all the people in North Africa were much more backward. They weren't like the European Jews. People didn't understand that. I think there is genuine fear that is largely misplaced also about the idea of like giving Jews their citizenship back and what's that going to do in terms of how Muslims respond. There are a variety of reasons, but yeah, basically, as you said, it's wartime chaos. So they're really, all they care about is a stable regime that feels pragmatic, that will enable them to continue the campaign in Europe.
What was the reason for the American distrust of de Gaulle? Is that purely personal?
Well, some of it is personal. Churchill had sort of a very tortured relationship with de Gaulle. Churchill and FDR are very close at this point in the war. I think, de Gaulle is, he's not particularly pliant, right? They're looking for somebody who they feel they can rely upon, who will, cooperate with them, and won't sort of have his own ideas. And de Gaulle, had this, thing where he, they had various confrontations with Vichy forces in Africa in the early days, and was viewed as kind of a little bit of a hothead in a certain way. Churchill has a line about how de Gaulle he can't bear the fact not only that the British helped the French, but that the French had to ask for help. So I think he's just regarded as sort of a difficult personality, and he's not on the ground, right? They're also looking for somebody who has, I think there's also the sense that de Gaulle's credibility, but they have this idea that the French army in North Africa with the right general, that's their other, Murphy's big thing is like, we're going to take the French army in North Africa that was allowed to remain in existence, and we're going to turn them, because it's a lot of troops, toward the Allies. And if we just have the right general, then when he calls out to the army and says, join us, they're going to listen. Giraud did not actually have that sort of magnetism, plus that he wasn't there. So there's that. So Raphael Abouquet goes over the radio and says he's Giraud. Doesn't work particularly well.
Go ahead, Barbara.
This may be a bit of a slant, but in France, there was a lot of work done by the Grand Mosque to spirit out Jewish children, especially Jewish boys, because both Muslims and Jews circumcised their sons. Was there any kind of collaboration or coordination or work that was done by the local Muslim community to protect the Jews in their communities?
So first, I have to, forgive me, do a little bit of a cautionary about the first part of your question. I wrote an article about this more than 10 years ago called "Did the Paris Mosque Save Jews?" Probably can find it. If not, happy to send it to you. It's a pretty limited number of people for whom we have any evidence that they were protected by the mosque. And that's, that resistance is important, and I don't want to discount it. But the director of the mosque, Sichador Ben Gabrit, he definitely helped some number of people, but probably nothing on the order of the 1,700 people that was reported for a long time on the website of the mosque. And we also know, and I've seen them myself, we have these documents in the archives where he is consulted by the Commissariat Général aux Questions Juives, the General Commissioner for the Jewish Question, about whether people who are claiming to be Muslim are in fact Muslim or whether they are Jews. And the cases that I have seen are where he indicates that the person does not appear to be a Muslim. And this happens as late as 43, 44, when people know more about the Shoah, when the resistance is more widespread. That's not to demonize him. He's ultimately most concerned about protecting his institution. But the point is, it's a complex story, and it has often been mythologized in a way that I think, well, I understand the attraction of it. Anyway, I talk also about the sort of influences in the memory in the piece that I wrote. And there's a movie which you might know, Les Hommes Libres, Free Men, which partly depicts part of this story. It's a fictional movie. Also wrote a review of that. Anyway, so that's just about the mosque. In Algiers, a little hard to tell sort of how widespread. So El Okbi, who I mentioned, is this major figure among the ulama, the so-called doctors of Islam in Algeria, who is very friendly with Jews and involved in interconfessional dialogue in the years before the war. And according to some accounts, he actually puts out a fatwa in 1940 that there should be no taking of Jewish property by Muslims. And that does appear to have been very widely observed. Right? There are very few Muslims who appear to have participated in seizure of Jewish property, unlike the settler classes in Algeria. So that's the biggest thing in terms of, we don't have roundups in Algeria, right? We don't have, the mosque's participation and the participation of some Muslim individuals in protecting individual Jews who are in danger of being rounded up. We don't have a context that's really parallel in Algeria. But we do have a lot of Jews who later say that, Muslims showed solidarity with them, that sort of like this was a period where they felt solidarity from their Muslim neighbors. So I think, there is a sense of a kind of sympathy from a lot of Muslims on the part of a lot of Jews in Algeria.
Are there any righteous among nations?
Well, that is the whole story. So there's a book called Among the Righteous by Robert Satloff, which it's a little bit more of a journalistic book, but he actually went around to a lot of camps. That one of the reasons we know about as many camps as we do is that Satloff, and he was really pioneering for writing about the Holocaust in North Africa. And so he was really determined to find a righteous among the nations. Like that was sort of the purpose of the book. Maybe now someone recently was named, I'm trying to remember, but there were one or two people who he made a very strong case for in that book. And then there was research done, but Yad Vashem did not embrace those cases. There definitely are Albanian Muslims who are among righteous in the nation. Ben Gavrit was considered a candidate, the rector of the Grand Mosque, in part because Salim Halali, who's a very famous Algerian Jewish musician, was, according to many accounts, protected by Ben Gavrit during the war, but they were never able to get what they felt was sufficient confirmation of that story about Ben Gavrit. And so he's never been named a righteous among the nations. So this is a point of significant sort of contention and tension.
We are out of time. So thank you to our speaker,